We live in a world where we have access to instant information, and algorithms like to play into each of our own biases. And that can bring up a lot of important questions, especially for public health, like what is misinformation and how is it different than disinformation? Whose responsibility is it to monitor these sorts of things? And what role does AI play in all this moving forward? Today we'll have an in-depth conversation with an expert on these topics, Dr. Kelly Garrett from Ohio State. You won't want to miss it. All that and more coming up on Health is Real.
Come on in, stay a while. Andrew Stinson alongside Angela Ta. The name of the podcast is Health is Real from Franklin County Public Health. Angela, how's it going today?
It's going real good, Andrew. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I'd love to introduce our guest today. It's Dr. Kelly Garrett, professor and the director of the School of Communication at Ohio State University. Dr. Garrett, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, the topic of misinformation, and this is a subject that I find very fascinating.
Yeah.
How do you research the subject of misinformation?
So, like any important social question, there are many ways that people can try and answer or understand things that are related to it. So if you want to understand how a particular dynamic works, you might do an experiment where you create some artificial messages, you put people in a somewhat contrived environment, and you see what happens as you alter the environment that they're in. So I've done this kind of work. For example, I've done some work that shows when people have been ostracized, made to feel like they're being socially excluded by a group, then they respond differently to fact-checking message than when they aren't ostracized. But sometimes you want to understand what's happening in the broader world. Experiments are kind of artificial, and they can seem a little strange because none of the things that you're doing are what would actually happen in the world. Plus, you're bringing people in, and it's into a lab, for example. It's just unusual. So we also will sometimes conduct surveys where we talk to people once or maybe even multiple times. Right now, I'm doing a panel study, multiple surveys, talking to the same group of people over the course of several months to understand how their beliefs about the election are changing as time goes by, as the media environment changes, and as their own personal experiences are changing. And there are other ways we can do it too. Sometimes we do observational work where we just go out and watch what people are doing in the real world so that we can understand, well, for example, when something happens in social media, what kinds of behaviors follow from the change in the platform.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I feel like mis and disinformation is typically, like, it feels sort of nebulous. Like, how do you get your arms around that and make that something concrete? And to do something concrete, like research it, that's really interesting. I like that there's multiple different ways to do it, right? Dr. Garrett, you and I actually met at a conference, a social media conference, where you talked about misinformation on social media in particular. What got you interested in that topic?
Yeah, so I have been thinking about the way the internet is changing Americans' approach to controversial political issues since grad school, so a couple decades now. One of the earliest questions that I was interested in had to do with whether people were going online and using these new technologies to try and shield themselves from ideas that they disagreed with. If that was the case, obviously it would be worrisome, and it would have troubling implications for people's ability to agree on what the truth is.
Right.
Now, if you spend any time online, you've probably seen lots of people yelling at each other.
Yeah.
So you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that that's not what I found. I didn't find that people were isolating themselves entirely. But that left open the question, well, what's going on? If people are encountering evidence that suggests their beliefs are wrong and then rejecting it, like why? How does that work? How is it that we can have such vastly different interpretations of the same information presented in the same news landscape?
That is that's a big question to try and answer.
Yeah, no. And I mean, we've always had misinformation. It's always been a thing. But I feel like, kind of to your point, the digital realm has amplified that, especially when it goes unchecked and people don't necessarily know where all their information is really coming from. Where does the responsibility lie in some of these situations? I mean, is it kind of like buyer beware? Everyone has to kind of just be aware of this now? Or do you think there's some more responsibility on part of the platforms to police this?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm glad you started by pointing out just how long rumoring and the use of deception have been a part of social life, of political life.
Yeah.
Right? We have history dating back to millennia. There's nothing new here. I do believe that social media and online news mean that these messages can travel a lot farther, and they can do so a lot faster. But there's this important distinction between the idea of putting messages in front of people and the idea of people believing those messages. People are complicated. We are predisposed to believe messages that make us look good, make other people like us look good. But we also don't like to be taken for fools. And so my suspicion when I first started in doing this work would be that there would certainly be a lot more exposure. People would see a lot more of these false and misleading claims. But it wasn't obvious to me that they would necessarily be dramatically changing their beliefs in light of it. And my research, and the research that other people are doing, suggests that it is actually a much more complicated dynamic. So, for example, the use of social media does not seem to be associated with significant changes in people's ability to tell what's true from what's false, all by itself. There is other research that suggests that who is responsible for the misleading messages can be quite important. So, for instance, if a high-profile politician is making a claim that is false, and this politician is someone that you align with, you're a Republican, it's a Republican, you're a Democrat, it's a Democrat, that people are predisposed to take seriously the claims that their political leaders are making. And this is not a strange or even by itself a troubling approach. Like we all have very complicated lives. No one has time to study every political decision. And there is value in having people that you trust.
Yeah.
The problem is that can be exploited. When people rely on heuristics, when they rely on shortcuts to know what's true, when they rely on opinion leaders or political elites or news organizations to help them sift through a very complicated media environment, if someone chooses to systematically repeat a falsehood, that's likely to show up in lots of places, including on social media. But it's most likely the action of the person promoting the falsehoods that's going to matter more than the fact that it happened to be amplified on social media. To be clear, I don't want to give social media a free pass. I think that social media companies should bear some responsibility for the kinds of content that are being shared on their networks, much like other publishers have some responsibility for the kinds of content that are being shared through their venues. But it's very complicated because the way media are produced on social media doesn't look anything like the way media are produced in these more traditional news outlets.
Right. Yeah, sort of like you could think of like a newspaper, right? Like the editors are doing a lot of back work to fact check things and do that, but they're also the ones sort of producing it. Whereas on social media, it's like everyone's producing it. So how do then the platforms sort of keep that in check when it's not tough. Really like their content? Yeah, it's so interesting.
And it begs important questions about the extent to which we want to regulate speech.
Yeah.
We already do, let's be clear.
Right.
It's not like you can say anything at any time to anyone. We have lots of rules around what kinds of speech are acceptable.
Right.
But this is a new domain, one which we, I think, as a society are still grappling with. Because I think there are some principles that many people would agree with. I think, in general, we don't want a foreign adversary attempting to manipulate American citizens by spreading disinformation.
Right.
I think most people would say, yeah, that's a problem. But perhaps, obviously, turns out that foreign powers trying to manipulate Americans don't go around advertising that that's what they're doing. They do everything they can to obscure their behaviors and make it look like they are just another American citizen sharing their own thoughts. Yeah. And so if we have to be sifting through claims and deciding, well, this person gets to speak and this one doesn't, that gets tricky very quickly.
Yeah. So just to clarify, I guess we probably could have started off with this, but you said disinformation. Can you just explain the difference between misinformation and disinformation for me and everybody else who's listening?
Sure.
Yeah, I can say a couple of things about it. The first thing I'd say is that the distinction in practice is actually pretty hard to make.
Okay.
The principle is pretty simple. When we say misinformation, we generally mean information that is not consistent with the best available evidence.
Okay.
Now, we don't always know the truth about every situation. We often have incomplete evidence, and so we have to make educated guesses about what's actually happening. Consider, for example, after the recent hurricanes that passed through the southern part of the U.S., there was a lot of damage to the communication infrastructure. And so it is actually quite difficult to say definitively, here is exactly what's happening on the ground. But we can say that the evidence that we have points to these things happening and not those things happening. So misinformation would be information that's incompatible with what we know. And that brings us to disinformation, which is when the misinformation is distributed with malicious intent.
Gotcha.
It's intentionally deceptive.
Okay.
It's intended to do harm, we often would say. And this is why I say in practice it's quite hard to sift through.
Because it's about the intent.
Because it's about the intent. If you can identify the source of the information as being affiliated with a foreign power, you might say, okay, well, that's pretty clear evidence that it's not true and it's a foreign power promoting it. Fair enough. But when two candidates for a political race have incompatible beliefs, does it mean that one is actually malicious and the other one is on the side of good and light? I mean, it's a very tempting way to simplify the world because we are a very politically divided nation right now. But in many cases, it's more complicated. People's truths can be informed by different experiences and different things that they know. And it's possible to inadvertently share information that's inaccurate.
Yeah. It leans a lot more on the perception that someone has and, like you said, the intention. That's so interesting.
Now, here at Franklin County Public Health, how do you see the overlap between the issue of misinformation and public health?
Yeah, it's actually pretty easy to identify the overlap because one of the charges of public health organizations, at least as I understand them, is to help educate the public about the risks that they face and what they can do to protect themselves.
Yeah.
And to be responsive in the face of a crisis, to make sure that you're managing that crisis in ways that ensure that most people are protected, are safe. Misinformation is a tremendous challenge for any kind of communication campaign. If you are trying to get people to take care of themselves, and that means you're communicating one set of messages about how people can do that. What is the nature of this particular threat, and what are the things that you can do to protect yourself? If there are other people who are saying just the opposite thing, then you risk having a sort of he said, she said debate. And say, well, I mean, I know that these people said that I should do this to protect myself, but what about those other people? And obviously, we've all lived through the COVID-19 pandemic. This is not purely hypothetical.
Did we all live through that?
Yeah,
I think so. I think we
in
made
some
it.
regards.
Yeah.
The three of us sitting around this table.
Yes.
When the pandemic began, I was already doing this kind of work, and I wondered, I hoped that given the life and death stakes, that Americans would be more skeptical of the kinds of falsehoods that we saw being shared in a variety of venues. In retrospect, I think my hope was half right. People were more skeptical, but it wasn't limited to skepticism towards the misleading claims.
Right.
People were more skeptical of everything.
Everything, yeah.
Including the messages coming from the experts, from the medical professionals, from the scientists who were trying to understand COVID, from the public health officials who were trying to help people protect themselves. Because there were others, media elites, politicians among them, saying, don't believe those so-called experts. We know what's best. You should be doing this completely contrary thing. And so the stakes were higher, but that doesn't make it easier to know who you should believe.
Yeah, the voices almost just get louder when the stakes are higher, like that, from both sides. Interesting. When you were talking about disinformation, it made me think of, people have been talking about like these like deep fakes and like images and videos that AI is creating, right? Like you almost have to bring AI into the conversation. Yeah, I mean, what would you say to someone who's trying to figure out what's real and what's fake, what's misinformation, what's disinformation in a world where AI can create anything?
Anything, yeah.
To the subject of AI, as you say, it's front and center. A lot of us are spending a lot of time thinking about it, including those of us who have to grade student papers, which may or may not have been generated with the aid of ChatGPT. Yeah, so it's a moving target, right? The technology is changing really quickly. So any advice that I offer right now about how to spot machine-produced fakes may be dated by the time a listener is hearing these words.
Sure.
Right? But that said, there are some strategies that I think that we can use. So when we're talking about images, video, and audio, for now, there are some things that these machines tend not to do very well at. The background audio, the background of still images, the background of video, there tend to be errors. And it can be hard to nail down exactly what's wrong.
Sure.
Maybe it's just too even. There's a lack of detail. It's just like no background is like that. That's just too regular. If you listen to the simulated AI audio, real audio, you can recognize discernible patterns in the sound that a crowd makes, for instance. And in AI-generated audio, the sound of the crowd is just not right. Like you're playing a video game and they didn't have a lot of time to spend on that, getting that background sound right.
Yeah.
When you're looking at images, we are fortunate so far in that these machines are not very good at certain kinds of details. Text, regularly, there are characters that show up that aren't actually letters in the English alphabet.
Oh.
Symbols that you're like, what is that? Spelling errors. Numbers that don't exist, and a variety of other things. Machines have also been pretty bad at fingers.
I've seen that. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Extra fingers sometimes on the hand.
Growing out of weird places.
Wasn't that part of the whole Kate Middleton thing when everyone was like, where is she? And they would put out a picture and everyone's like, that's AI generated because look at her hands.
So what you're saying basically is look in detail. Don't just take a glancing look, because sometimes the hidden things in the background just don't quite add up to what a normal picture should look like.
That's the gist of it. But I'm going to actually pivot, if I can, to talking about some more general strategies.
Yeah.
Because I think these more general strategies will work well in the face of machine-created images and other kinds of content. AI-generated articles are also a thing. So there's an acronym that another misinformation scholar came up with, SIFT, S-I-F-T. Very simple series of steps, and they just talk through them and explain how they can be helpful. So first I'll say what they mean. S for stop, I for investigate, F for finding other sources, and then T for tracing the original source. Okay, so stop. Why stop? Well, the first thing we know is that we're all biased. All of us human beings.
No.
You just can't avoid it. Yeah,
Okay.
I know
You don't say.
Yeah. And one of the ways that biases play out, we tend to accept claims that are good for us without a lot of careful thought, whereas claims that make our side look bad, we tend to be very skeptical of.
Okay.
Another bias, when we are angry, we respond more quickly and with less careful consideration. So if you see a claim that just seems too awful to be true, you might say it's too good to be true for your side, right? Like, I can't believe the other side did that awful thing. That's a great indicator that someone may be trying to exploit your instincts. Your instincts are to share this word as quickly as possible because everyone has to know
how terrible this thing is. Yeah.
Exactly. So recognizing your bias when you see something like, oh, that's so classic. That's perfect. I have to share that and let everyone know. It's maybe worth asking yourself, okay, wait, it's so perfect. How sure am I that this is real? Okay, so you've stopped. Now what? Well, investigating. A common approach that people take when they hear investigate is think, I'm just going to study this one piece of content really carefully, which is the point that we were just talking about with artificially generated images. If I study the image really carefully, I might be able to find some telltale signs that it's not right. But it turns out an even better strategy is to investigate broadly, to read widely. So if a story is true, there will probably be other stories from different sources making the same point. There will probably be other pictures taken of the same event. If you can't find other pictures, or if you find other stories and they're talking about the situation in a very different way, that means you've got more work ahead of you. Next is finding other sources. Well, this is a part of that investigation strategy, right? Reading broadly. And then finally, tracing the original context. It turns out that at least right now, these fakes generated from whole cloth, just entire fabrications, are relatively rare. What is more common is that a claim or an image will be taken out of context, and someone will say, look at this terrible thing, or listen to this terrible soundbite. But heard in context, seen with the proper context, you might realize, oh, it's not so bad. So we even have cases of people sharing pictures that are a decade old and taken in another country and saying, this happened in the US yesterday. If you can trace the original image, then you can just double check and make sure, this really is what the person said. It is the context in which they said it versus, oh, wait a second, this picture wasn't taken in the US yesterday. That was in Paris 2014, right? That matters a lot.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I was thinking about, I follow a frog account on Instagram. They just post frog memes all the time.
Is it really the frog posting though?
It is though, but they had a video and it was this frog that had wings, and everyone in the comments, people, they were so divided. They were like, that's an AI generated thing, and it's like, that's a frog hugging a dragonfly. No one could decide what it was. So it's interesting. I want to see if I could trace the original of that.
And how would someone trace? Because that's an interesting thought to okay, that image was from another country from 10 years ago as opposed to yesterday here in America. How would I go about tracing that image?
Yeah, so image tracing has actually gotten a lot easier in the last several years. Search engines like, for example, Google, allow you to do a reverse image search. You can save the image to your computer, then you can open up a browser and go to Google and drop that image onto the Google search page, and Google will say, oh, look, here are all the other copies that we can find of that image. That's not a guarantee. It's not going to work every time, but it can definitely help. If you don't have an image, if it's text, you can take a passage of the text and search for that. Regularly find plagiarized content that way, right? You can find pieces of evidence that show up in other stories.
So this has got me thinking, especially when we were talking about COVID-19, right? There are, kind of like you described, there's people who will sort of believe everything they see because it puts them and theirs in a good light, versus people who are just skeptical of everything across the board. They're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater every time. How do you build trust as, maybe an outside entity trying to speak to that wide range of people? How would you suggest building trust?
So the first thing I'd say is that while that range that you described may well exist, there may be some people out there who really do believe everything they see, and there may be some who are skeptical of everything. I think that the vast majority of Americans fall in that happy middle ground.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Most people want to hold accurate beliefs. As I mentioned earlier, no one wants to be taken for the fool. And the fact that people can be misled has as much to do with the fact that they're busy, very reasonably busy, and people they trust can exploit that busyness, or even if it's not someone exploiting it, it's a really complicated world. There's a lot of information that we're taking in every day.
So much.
So given that big range, I think The thing that scares me more, actually, is the person who distrusts everything. So your example of the frog with wings is actually, it's a nice illustration of what I think is one of the big challenges of the evolving information environment, in that it is getting a little bit harder to make those quick heuristic decisions. Like things that we used to be able to take for granted, I will obviously be able to spot a faked image. You can't take it quite so for granted. And while we have the tools, we are capable of doing the work to sort out what's true and what's not. Do we actually have the time to do that for every claim? My guess is that the frog with wings doesn't matter that much.
Yeah,
if you're a little bored, you might spend some time trying to fact check it. But yeah, so what if it's not right? But if there is a health crisis, then the tools that we have are available, but crises are hard, because crises mean that you have even fewer resources to spend trying to sort through what's true and what's not.
Well, right? And then you put the emotional, reaction on top of that. And it's like, I don't know, I'm too scared. I don't really have the time to sit down and figure all this out. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So you asked, how do organizations that want to be helpful, what can they do, right? So I imagine hypothetically we might be speaking about a public health organization.
Yeah, hypothetically.
That's trying to think about how to reach the diverse base of people that it serves, right?
Yeah.
And there are a couple things that you can do. I think that it is very sensible to rely on evidence, although there are some who are skeptical of experts and scientists. That's usually bounded. It's not like most Americans distrust scientists. It's like people distrust scientists in particular instances when they've been warned, you should be distrustful of this claim. But in general, most Americans actually feel pretty good about their doctors, about the medical profession, about the scientists who are studying these questions. And to the first responders who have sort of on-the-ground expertise around the crises. So to the extent that you can be transparent about what you know and put information out there so people can see it, it can help. Now, some people will respond to heightened transparency with increased careful review and more skepticism. So you also shouldn't go into it, you shouldn't be naive about it. You should expect that there are going to be some people who are going to question, and that doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's a lost cause. It just means your goal is to reach as many people as you can. And by sharing with people the information that you have, by recognizing and being encouraging the critical thinking that people do. Critical thinking can sometimes lead people astray, but more often it will help them ultimately find more accurate information. And so recognizing that and applauding people for being concerned that they might be tricked, or that they might not have the most accurate information, and then explaining, and here's where or why this information that we have is most accurate. The one warning that I would offer to people thinking about public health, working in public health, and other organizations that have to respond to questions for the public, is that there are also a few, not many, but a few bad actors who will raise questions not because they want to understand, not because they want to be persuaded, but because they just want to keep you busy. And that's a challenging thing to respond to, because, again, it's very hard to know what someone's intentions are. But my recommendation would be to go in with good faith to try and answer someone's questions. If they just keep coming back with the same questions, or each question leads to another question, at some point you might say, okay, here are the resources that are available, and we'll circle back, but for now we're going to have to be focusing on helping this other set of questions that we've got, right? It's complicated, but there are ways to deal with it.
Yeah, especially as someone who does a lot of the social media as well for the agency, I know exactly what you're talking about. There are people who, I think there are people who genuinely ask questions. There are people that are genuinely concerned, but then, you get a time or two, you get the person who's they just want to spout off, and I'm like, okay, here's the answer within your concern. Here's what we can offer you within your concern. And they just keep going. And I'm like, okay, I don't really know what to say anymore. So hopefully that helped.
So I'm glad you brought up this context of offering corrections on social media, because I want to underscore just how valuable what you are doing can be. And this goes for anyone, right? Like we talked about strategies that you can use to protect yourself. Now let's talk about how you can help make the information environment better for everyone else. One of the best things you can do is that when you see someone in your network, someone you know, sharing something that isn't accurate, to offer some evidence that is responsive to the claim that they're making. I'm not talking about being aggressive and in their face and saying, you stupid, like, how could you think that? But instead say, oh, that doesn't sound like what I heard. Here's a link to a news story that I saw on the topic. Now, you may not persuade that one person, the person you're responding to. But remember in the beginning of this podcast when I was talking about one of the ways that we study misinformation is by watching what happens on social media over time. One thing we've learned by doing these very large observational studies of millions and millions of users, we've learned that when someone posts a correction, the conversation around that falsehood dies down rapidly. The number of people sharing that falsehood drops quickly. So you may feel like you're kind of shouting into the void because you said something and the person you talked to says, no, I know I'm still right. But hundreds of people may very well see that exchange. And even though they may never say anything, you have had an impact. And I find that very encouraging personally because it's a reminder that you aren't powerless in the face of what can sometimes feel like this giant ocean of misinformation.
Yeah. Well, and I love that thought of it goes further than you think, right? Like you may feel like it's sort of, like you said, shouting into the void. But yeah, there's always watching eyes that you could be correcting at the same time or you're just giving them more information, even if they're not the person you're directly talking to.
Now, since we're talking about this, I'll make one last point, which is that correcting people you don't know doesn't always work quite as well.
No, really?
Sure.
It sort of
Absolutely not.
depends on the environment. Like
Yeah.
Reddit users are used to being corrected by people they don't know, so maybe that's not such a big deal. But if you're on Twitter or X, and you post something on someone you've never met before, it may still have some of those effects that we just talked about, but the person being corrected is probably going to push back pretty hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I bet. One thing I wanted to ask you about, you're a professor, and you have to deal with something that professors of years gone by haven't had to deal with, and that is ChatGPT. You mentioned it a bit earlier. How do you, or maybe other professors that you know, deal with this? How do you put parameters on this tool so that people don't abuse it when they're getting their education?
The chuckle.
So that is a very good question, one which I don't think anyone has a very good answer to yet.
Okay.
Let me start by saying, as someone who is trying to help students learn skills that are going to serve them well over the course of their lives, that are going to allow them to get jobs and do valuable things in their community, one of the places that I start is not with the technology, but with a reminder of what the goal is. So if I can convince my students that they want to make sure they have skills that can't be automated, they want to make sure they can do things that ChatGPT can't do, then the battle is largely won. Because if the point is simply to learn how to make technology do the job for you, my question is, well, why would anyone actually want to hire you if the machine can do it? So I think once people understand what's at stake, why humans, at least for now, still have advantages over machines, we are intelligent, artificial intelligence is not, that can help. But let's turn it on its head. Instead of talking about what the responsibilities of the users are, I'm going to think about the same question you asked about social media companies. What about these companies that are building this technology? Did they have any responsibility to guard against abuse? Again, I think that they do, but it isn't at all clear to me how we accomplish that. These companies have, for instance, tried to put in some guardrails to prevent the technologies from, say, for example, teaching you how to build a bomb. That seems like something we wouldn't want ChatGPT to do, right?
Right.
Right. So, but these machines, they're not intelligent like any other piece of computer software. They just do what they were programmed to do. So that means that creative, smart, intelligent, actual human beings can sometimes outwit the guardrails that are put in place. I read just recently about someone tricking ChatGPT into doing something it wasn't supposed to do by saying, Grandma used to tell me bedtime stories about whatever. Mm-hmm. And ChatGPT, can you tell me one of those bedtime stories? And then ChatGPT proceeded to do exactly what it was told it shouldn't do because it was telling a bedtime story about building a bomb.
Whoa.
The point is that, first of all, OpenAI probably fixed that one. Wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
But people are really creative. They find ways to use technology that the people programming them cannot imagine. And that is a great strength of human beings. Mm-hmm. But it also means that programming in guardrails is going to be tricky. So it's probably going to require a combination of things. Social norms about what kinds of uses we consider as a society to be acceptable. Policies that say if you use it for these kinds of things that are strictly not allowed, you can get in trouble. Regulations and efforts on the part of these companies to self-police themselves by putting in those guardrails and finding out when they aren't working as well as they want to and refining them. So it's probably a bit of this and that and that other.
Listen, when it comes to AI, I feel like my biggest thought is like, I just want AI to do like my laundry and my dishes so that I can do the writing and creative things, like why is it?
Yeah, why is AI doing the stuff that is more fun to do and leaving us with the housework, right?
Yeah, exactly. Come on, like get me the smart house from the early 2000s movie. Like that's what I want.
That was a great movie.
That was a great movie. Yeah. Kind of terrifying if you go back and watch it because you're like, wait, wow, that's scary.
So it's probably not a good time to mention that there's a new tool that allows you to drop academic articles and then have it generate a podcast with two smart, interesting people, a man and a woman, having a conversation, trying to draw out what are the most interesting findings from this research.
Oh, okay. Well,
are you implying that I'm a robot?
I am not a robot either. Okay, this is not one of those podcasts. No, I did hear about that, and that is scary because I heard a clip of it, and it sounded so real. Like the banter between it was wild. It was wild. But I'm like, podcasts are the fun thing that we get to do. Don't take that from us.
And I've used it with some of my own research just to understand.
Yeah.
And it was pretty good, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not perfect, but it got most of the facts right. And the sort of interesting parts of the work, it did a nice job of pulling out what was really interesting. And I'll tell you, as an academic, I don't always succinctly capture the most interesting parts of my own work. So it was kind of interesting to hear a machine do it for me.
Sure.
Well, listen, we'll get you out of here on this one. This is a question we like to ask all our guests. It's kind of like a pageant question or a Miss America question. Like, if you could wave a magic wand and change anything you wanted about misinformation, this is the subject at hand today, what would you change? I know it's a big question. You have a lot of power in your hands that you're wielding at the moment.
With the wand.
With the wand. What would you change?
So I'm going to give a somewhat pithy answer. If I could wave that magic wand, I would create a world in which we can get back to agreeing about the facts while disagreeing about what they mean for how policy should work, how society should be structured. I actually think that that's not a fantasy world. It took a lot of work to build it, right? The idea that citizens should be well informed and educated around important issues so that they can deliberate around them and that they will often disagree. This was a relatively new idea with the advent of democracy in the U.S., and we have done great things seeing the idea exported to all parts of the world. And right now, it feels a little trying that we have lost track of the value of agreeing about the facts. Because if you can argue over the facts, then it can slow the conversation around policy decisions. But I also think that a lot of people share my desire to get back to a place where we can say, all right, let's set some ground rules, decide what is it going to take to agree on what's right, what's true, and what's false. And then from there, we can argue over how to use that information to make important decisions.
Absolutely. Dr. Kelly Garrett, he is the professor and director of School of Communication at Ohio State University. Dr. Garrett, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I was going to cut you off and say the Ohio State University.
I'm sorry. The Ohio State University.
Thank you for listening to the Health is Real podcast from Franklin County Public Health. We want to hear from you. Let us know your thoughts at fcph@franklincountyohio.gov, and be sure to follow us on your favorite social media platforms. And did you know that we offer vaccine clinics and education throughout Franklin County for both children and adults? Talk to a public health nurse to ask questions or schedule your vaccine appointment by calling us at 614-525-3719 or email shots@franklincountyohio.gov.